morning of July 1st, 1937, the Gestapo arrived to arrest Martin Niemöller at his rectory in Berlin. He would spend the next 8 years as a prisoner in the Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps, narrowly escaping execution. The Lutheran pastor had become known as one of the leading voices of the confessing church, and at the time of his arrest, it was controversial both in and out of Germany. But for most of us, he is perhaps best known for the poetic rendering of a speech he gave in 1946 known as "First They Came." It sounds like some of you know it. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. And we talked about Niemöller briefly back in February because as powerful and as cautionary as this poem is, it wasn't just that Niemöller didn't speak out. In the early years, he was actually quite pro-Hitler. In our longing to find and recognize those who resisted the rise of National Socialism, Niemöller's post-war activism has helped us curate a myth about the church's opposition to Nazism, but the reality is there wasn't that much of it. If you've heard of it at all, the confessing church is often referred to as an ecumenical movement that pushed back against the Nazis and their influence on the church in Germany, a movement that ultimately failed. But the truth is more nuanced. In 1933, in an effort to align the church with National Socialism, Adolf Hitler appointed Ludwig Müller as Reichsbishop. Anybody speak German? How do we say that? Reichsbishop. Yeah, exactly. He was the appointed head of the German Evangelical Church, which is a consolidation of different churches. And while this was controversial to some, it was perhaps for the wrong reasons. Many, if not most, German pastors were in favor of Aryanizing what was becoming known as the German church. But some pastors opposed what they began to see as a deification of Hitler. This was the impulse that created the confessing church, representing Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics who found a common voice in the Barmen Declaration written in 1934 that reasserted that Jesus was, in fact, Lord and head of the church, not any political Führer. Now, this kind of seems hardly controversial, but at the time, Barmen was, in a way, a rebuke of the creeping idea that Hitler and Nazism would and could define the church. But this never meant that the confessing church pastors were anti-Nazi. Quite the opposite, many of them, Niemöller included, longed for strong leadership and believed that National Socialism had an infectious vitality that could bring back self-respect, discipline, and selflessness, along with some healthy morality to the German people. What they were against was having their sphere of influence, their siloed power, being determined by those outside of the church. And we don't want these politicians coming in and telling us how to run our churches. You know, history has criticized the confessing church for its silence around the persecution of the vulnerable, Jews, gypsies, socialists. But that was never really the point of the confessing church. They failed because they did not understand the moment that they were in. They thought that they could protect their small spiritual plots on the German cultural landscape. What they didn't realize was that the Germans were coming for it all. Following his appointment to the Reichsbishop, which granted the Nazi Party broad jurisdiction over internal church affairs, Ludwig Müller addressed the National Synod triumphantly. "The old has come to an end. The new has begun. The political church struggle is over. The struggle for the soul of the people now begins." For Müller and his compatriots, this meant professing and evangelizing an interpretation of Christianity that was so closely intertwined with nationalism that it was hard to say where one began and the other ended. The confessing church spoke of resistance, but it was formed to uphold the centrality of the Bible, if not its actual message. For example, it was silent about Kristallnacht. Render unto Caesar seemed to be its guiding value. Let the politicians have the culture. We just want the church. This is about power, not virtue. And regardless of revisionism, the confessing church was not really a resistance organization. It was a failure of imagination and vision. We perhaps only speak of it today due to the lasting fame of some of its leaders. Niemöller, of course, who became a very active anti-war activist and participated in lots of areas of the movement in the second half of the last century. Karl Barth, if you're a theology nerd, principal author of the Barmen Declaration and one of the best-known Calvinist theologians of the last century. And if we're honest, it's probably the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer that allows for the confessing church to have any sense of legitimacy. As some of you know, Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and theologian who plotted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. He was arrested on April 5th, 1943, and was executed 2 years later on April 9th, 1945, as Nazism was collapsing, a mere 21 days before Hitler would suicide himself. A last act of vengeance, it would seem. It would take the German state another 51 years before it would expunge the charge of treason that led to his hanging. And while some people still read his books, The Cost of Discipline has been described as a modern classic, most really don't. His writing is too Christian for most liberals and too anti-fascist for most conservatives. Still, Dietrich Bonhoeffer exists within the popular imagination for those who want to wrestle with what does it mean or what it means to be a patriot. That is, are you willing to be a traitor for the sake of humanity? Bonhoeffer was a key founding member of the Confessing Church, and in the early years, he preached on the church's responsibility to work for peace. He seriously considered moving to India to study nonviolent resistance with Mahatma Gandhi. But within just 6 years of the Barmen Declaration, Bonhoeffer was engaged in a violent attempt to overthrow Hitler and the Nazi regime. And while he never left the Confessing Church, it's clear that somewhere along that path, he awakened to the reality of their situation in a way that most of his contemporaries did not. His willingness to engage in the conspiracy came from a metabolizing of Christianity, not as identity, but as his very lifeblood. Writing to a dear friend from prison, Bonhoeffer states, "Only when one loves life and the earth so much that without them everything seems to be lost, and at its end may one believe in the resurrection of the dead and a new world." This isn't a statement of faith or an ideological position. Bonhoeffer acted because he had fallen in love with the world. He exists as one of the true Christian martyrs of the last century, but not because of his involvement in the Confessing Church, almost despite it. Right? In a letter celebrating his godson's baptism, just a few months before he was executed, he cautioned, "We believed we could make our way in life with reason and justice. And when both failed us, we no longer saw any way forward. We have also overestimated time and again the importance of reasonableness and justice in influencing the course of history. Speaking directly to his godson, you who are growing up in the midst of a world war where 90% of humankind doesn't want, but for which they are giving their lives and goods, will learn from childhood that this world is ruled by forces against which reason can do nothing. Words that seem to confront us today. There's a quote that's often attributed to Mark Twain that goes, "History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes." The author is probably Theodor Reich, a Jewish student of Sigmund Freud who emigrated to the United States in 1938. To suggest what happened in Germany in the 1920s, 30s, 40s is repeating in the United States today is not correct. But it rhymes. We are witnessing a conflation of Christianity and nationalism so completely it's hard to know where one begins and the other ends. We are hearing people talk about the pollution of the national blood. I wouldn't quite say, as Ludwig Müller did, that the political church struggle is over, but I do believe we are very much in the struggle for the soul of the people. The overturning of Roe v. Wade is being credited as inspiring many people to get engaged and vote. But the fix may already be in. Voting may no longer be enough. Roe v. Wade and even that attempted coup on January 6, 2021 are not events that set our troubled politics in motion. They are the consequence of long-term organizing. Speaking this year at CPAC, the annual conference for conservative activists and U.S. elected officials just across the water at National Harbor this year, alt-right influencer Jack Posobiec greeted the crowd by saying, "Welcome to the end of democracy. We are here to overthrow it completely." Posobiec said, this as the event began, "We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it and replace it with this right here," as he raised his fist and the crowd went wild. He then continued, "Because all glory is not to government, all glory to God." This man has more than 2.5 million followers on Twitter. It might be logical to understand the efforts of the GOP officials in Ohio who are trying to remove Biden from the election as some sort of quid pro quo for Colorado's attempt to remove Trump, but this is too facile, I think. Trump is a seditionist, and the 14th Amendment is clear. But by conflating the two, it gives convenient cover for the anti-democratic partisans who have been gerrymandered into power. It is part of a unified assault that includes defunding public education, delegitimizing elections and government, and subjugating marginalized communities like women, people of color, and queer people. Every day, we are losing more of our rights. Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, and Arizona now bar or deter judges from granting divorces if you are pregnant. Each of these 4 states also have near total bans on abortion, which means that you must stay pregnant against your will and you cannot legally divorce an abusive partner. This is frighteningly cruel when you learn that homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant and postpartum people in the United States. The Louisiana Supreme Court just ruled that priests have the right not to be sued for sexual abuse. And in Florida, before felons can vote, they must pay off their court debts. But they also charge $50 a day for their incarceration, leaving people with amounts that they will never pay off. But it is more than just our rights that are at stake. We are in the struggle for the soul of the people. And we must decide if we have learned anything from the failure of the confessing church or not, because it is increasingly plausible that some articulate voice in the future, might easily write to a loved one from prison saying, "We believed we could make our way in life with reason and justice, and when both failed us, we no longer saw any way forward." We have also overestimated time and again the importance of reasonableness and justice in influencing the course of history. History is not repeating itself, but it is rhyming. This movement existed before Trump. It will exist after Trump. But have we understood what is actually happening? Partisan attempts to exert control over courts and law enforcement threaten the rule of law and equal justice. Systematic disinformation and conspiracy theories detached from facts make it hard to even agree on a shared reality. Extreme partisan polarization and the politics of domination over cooperation make it hard to maintain any governing norms or stability. Rising illiberal, authoritarian, nativist, and anti-democratic strains on the right are challenging core liberal democratic principles that we've long taken for granted. Taken for granted. Taken for granted. We must vote. Yes, we must vote. But simply going through the motions of voting as usual without sustained pro-democracy mobilization and reform efforts will not be enough to safeguard the democratic governance and the rule of law that protects the most vulnerable among us. Progressives and liberals have traditionally placed great faith in institutions like the courts and bureaucracies. I believe in government. I believe in paying my taxes. I do. I love it. I have lived where people don't have good roads. I believe in these things. We believe in the established processes that constrain the excesses and resolve disputes. But I worry that we now live with an over-reliance on these guardrails, that we take them for granted. And much like the confessing church who thought the Nazis would just leave the church alone as long as the church stayed out of politics until they came for me and there was no one left to speak out for me. You know, this is understandable, right? We have lived for a long period of relative political stability. And it's psychologically hard to accept that the norms that we've taken for granted are breaking down. But the left is living in a dream that assumes that one day there will be a return to politics as usual, even as that's looking increasingly unlikely. We cling to fantasies that hold aloft cross-partisan cooperation that Republicans no longer reciprocate. We pride ourselves on civility, rationality, and openness, perhaps excessively so, perhaps arrogantly so. And many of us see a values-forward approach as uncomfortably close to the emotionally charged, norm-breaking style of the right. I don't want to be like them. Well, we may not like to be like them right until there's nothing left. We grasp at classically liberal beliefs in universal reason and the assumption of good faith actors on all sides. And this leaves us flat-footed against the politics of disinformation and zero-sum domination. It seems so strange because the church seems like it should be, oh, let's learn how to do nonviolence. We need to learn how to fight. They are not going to stop at Mason Hill Road just because you're nice, or just because you're educated, or just because you're white, or just because you're straight. They're not stopping there. They are coming for it all. What is it going to take for us to awaken to Bonhoeffer's spiritual truth that only when one loves life and the earth so much that without them everything seems to be lost? What is it going to take for us to choose life over death, to reject the allure of good manners and roll up our sleeves, to understand the moment that we're in and sacrifice comfort for liberation? There is no allied army that's going to land on the beaches of France. Right? This is our work to do. The confessing church waited too long. They refused to change, and they lost everything. We must become something new if we want to hold on to what is truly valuable. I'm so grateful that you sang that hymn, that anthem, right? We are a force when we march arm in arm, when we walk together. We don't have to be the same as them, but we need to learn about our power. How do we empower the right people? How do we disempower the wrong people? This is part of the soul work that's facing us.